With that success, I think they've felt that they can move ahead in some other areas and now are tackling prescription drug abuse.
The different types of prescription medications out there, such as opiates, stimulants, tranquilizers, stuff like that.
When I see youth who have worked with us when they were in high school, go on to college, and then choose to come back to Fall River to make a difference, that's something that gives me lots and lots of hope.
I think Fall River really needs to understand that health is really at the base of all the things that need to happen to make this community a more viable place to live.
We've come a really long way. People from outside our community are saying that the work we're doing matters and is changing things.
Fall River has a really bright future because we're tackling some of these problems.
Con los terroristas.
And do the Harlem Shake.
Hi, I'm Henry Louis Gates Jr., and I love CCTV.
Hi, I'm Mark Lloyd. I'm the author of Prologue to a Farce, Communication.
Lovely Monday evening, everyone. This is How Soon Is Now, a half hour where we talk about the great and not so great aspects of life and everything in between. My name is Alan. Today we have a couple of guests. This is George and Dave from the Revolution Communist Party. They are also volunteers at Revolution Bookstore in Harvard Square. And how are you guys doing tonight?
Excellent.
Good? All right.
First, let me say we're supporters of that party and the movement for revolution in the U.S.
But not actual members.
Not actual members. All right. So talk about the RCP, Revolution Communist Party.
Well, we're posing a new vision for humanity, essentially. We find the moment that we're stuck in today just horrible for millions of people around the world. Alan, we met you. We were out at National Hoodie Day in Central Square,
Right.
which was an effort around the start of the trial of George Zimmerman related to the murder of Trayvon Martin, which I'm sure many in the audience know about, and how so many people identify with this young black man who was basically profiled and murdered based on skin color and a hoodie and a bag of Skittles, and just outrageous. And to us, that's indicative of so much what's wrong with this society. That in that case, actually, it took 44 days for the police to actually make an arrest.
Right.
Because the assumption was the black kid did something wrong, and that's just outrageous for us.
Dave, would you like to say something?
Yeah, and it's just an issue that we want to keep people's attention on because it's emblematic of the general problem with, black people being incarcerated at much greater rates than other races, and just, there's still institutionalized racism in our society, and we need to deal with it.
Okay. So like you said, it did take about 6 weeks for Zimmerman to be arrested. What do you think is the main reason why the police didn't take action?
Well, I can't speak to the individual police's decisions, but obviously Florida has the stand your ground law, which, I disapprove of that kind of law in general. I think it, encourages people to, to attempt to take the law into their own hands potentially, and leads to situations like this. So, the police, under that law, they do have the judgment, to make that choice, not to make an arrest in that case. Obviously a lot of people felt they made the wrong choice, and that's why it became such a flashpoint of protest, which I'm glad it did, because I think, there should be a fair trial to determine whether what happened was self-defense or not.
Okay. So, I've been doing a lot of research about the party and reading the newspaper Revolution, and there's 3 main points that Chairman Robert Vakian makes. And the second one, it's many different groups who protest and rebel against things the system does, and these protests and rebellions should be supported and strengthened. Yet it is only those with nothing to lose but their chains who can be the backbone of a struggle to actually overthrow the system. Now, in your opinion, who would you say has the characteristics and the background of somebody who does have nothing to lose?
Well, if you look at what Avakian's been saying, there's an interview that you can listen to him online, but he talks about, as Malcolm X posed it, people who are catching hell every day in America. And basically he's talking about dispossessed people, basically people of color, black and brown people. And this continues to be the case. I mean, if you go back a ways, this is a country that was founded on slavery. That was the basis for the original economy, the US of A. And then went through the whole area of lynching, the lynching era, and now what many people consider today to be the new Jim Crow, with mass incarceration, with racial profiling. But it's created this situation where you have a significant number of people, millions of these people on the bottom, essentially, who haven't had access to real jobs because a lot of the jobs have moved to other countries. So a very dispossessed element of people who I think present the possibility and the basis for a future movement for revolution in relation to other people who also have interests in wanting a new world. Not that it would just be people on the bottom, but a whole new mix that could bring forward millions of people and work towards the overthrow of the system, which I think is urgently needed if we're going to have a world worth living in.
Okay. So the word overthrow, historically, it does have like violent connotations to it. Is the view of the RCP, is it like violence overthrown, or are there non-violent, peaceful ways to change a system?
Well, I think that we think it's very dubious that the system would ever fundamentally change, from within, and that ultimately there might need to be violence if enough of the people in this country want change and the powers that be won't allow it. And that's the situation we want to help create. We're not in favor of, small groups engaging in violence, trying to cause trouble. And, personally, speaking entirely for myself, if it could be done nonviolently, that would be wonderful. That would be the best thing. But, the more I think about the things that are going on and the ways in which, we see that our government is keeping an eye on us, the more I think that if enough people become convinced that there needs to be a real radical change, it's going to have to happen violently.
Is it possible to have a stable society through violence?
Well, we had a revolution in 1776, right?
Well, it's about a different kind of a society. We're talking about socialism and working toward a world of cooperative communism. But we're talking about a vision catching hold among millions of people. We're not talking about a situation where millions of people are out to get revenge or get even. That's not the kind of revolution we're talking about. And that's why I think Bob Avakian's writings and his thinking is so critical to look at, because he's posing a different model for a socialist revolution and a way of trying to work with people. And there's a slogan we've been using, fight the power and transform the people for revolution. So people today who are suffering terribly but still are not in a state of mind to actually bring forward something better. And there's a need for people to transform their thinking in order to be part of a revolution and be part of building a new kind of a society. Mm-hmm. And that's quite a challenge, no doubt.
So, I've been listening to some of Bob Avakian's interviews, and he does say that it might take tens of millions of people to actually galvanize a change and start a revolution. Do you think that's possible in 2013?
I think it's very, very unlikely that soon, yeah. But, that's what, our mission, I think, is to, spread as much as we can the idea that it's possible, and the idea that it's something people should at least think about. Because the political discourse in this country is so incredibly limited to basically two parties you can support that really aren't that different from each other in terms of their fundamental politics. There are differences. I'm not saying they're exactly the same. But, I think people need to consider a much wider range of options. And that's what drew me into this movement, was just that I think, I want to get people thinking about it.
Well, realistically speaking, most people, you pose this to them about revolution, they think you're a little crazy, because the mood today is so complacent, and people are just kind of getting by and learning to live in a certain way to go along with things. But there's underlying that, there's a certain dissatisfaction, especially in other places. I mean, if you look at what's erupting now in Brazil on a scale of literally millions of people waking up, or Turkey, that could happen here at a different moment. It's not where we're at now, but it certainly is the basis and need for that to happen. And on the other hand, what is happening here, it really cries out for some kind of awakening and upheaval. If you think about what's been revealed with Mr. Snowden and the surveillance, the leaks about the National Security Agency, and the government lying to people about it. I mean, just a few weeks ago, Clapper, the head of the intelligence, said, we're not spying on anybody in Congress. He openly lied about it. And now we know that's all, it's a whole different ballgame. And now the government, instead of dealing with it, the people, both Democrats and Republicans, are trying to just focus on, let's get this Snowden, instead of talking about the substance of why does this system feel the need to spy on its own people? Basically, the capitalist system is showing it's afraid of its own people, which is something people should think about. Why are they so afraid of you out there, and what you might do when you find out the truth about the government's kill list with the drones and what the wars are really about, and what are the future plans for war. So a whole mix of things that people need to rebel over, I would say.
So we're having a great conversation. If you guys want to call in and ask Dave or George any questions, the number is 617-876-0055. Call in and we will answer your call. I want to go back a little bit to mass incarceration. Right now, 2.5 million Americans are either in federal or state prisons. 1 out of every 100 adult is in jail right now. If the revolution were to start tomorrow, what will happen to these 2.5 million people in jail?
Well, I can say one thing. We have a newspaper revolution. I mean, it's online at revcom.us, but we have a newspaper, and the biggest circulation of this newspaper is people in jail today, which is not to say that all the prisoners are politically conscious and they understand the workings of capitalism and Karl Marx, but there's an element there that's seriously disaffected and has been greatly wronged by the system. I mean, we know the war on drugs has disproportionately targeted blacks and Latinos, and people have just gone through hell in many ways and forced into criminal lives in many ways. So there's a great dissatisfaction, but there's also people that have obviously done terrible things in prison. So if we have a constitution for a future socialist republic, and it talks about this process of transforming and what would happen after the revolution if we succeeded. And there is a particular process articulated about working with people who've been in prison, rather than just say, oh, okay, everybody's free, and working with people to help them to transform and be part of a productive society, and in the interim even being part of the movement for revolution. So we put a lot of attention on people in that situation, because this society never gave them a chance. I mean, there's a quote from Avakian where he says, no more generations of our youth, who forced to live with this, forced to be, who never had a chance. Before they were born, this system had a plan for them to fail. And that's disproportionately black and brown youth. Either the police were going to brutalize them or kill them, or they were going to end up in criminal lives and in jail. And the system never had a chance, never offered them a chance. And that's just not right.
And I don't recall if the Constitution specifically talks about sort of the transition period about that. But for instance, I would advocate, people who are in jail for possession crimes should just be released, with an amnesty at that point. Because that's what the whole mass incarceration system is based on, is over criminalizing, these very meaningless crimes.
Drug offenses.
Yeah, and especially just possession of drugs. And I also wanted to add a statistic on top of the ones you quoted. I read recently that 1 in 28 children in this country has a parent in jail or in prison, which is just amazing.
That's scary. It's startling.
We also have a situation where people are held in solitary. I think up to 50,000 prisoners are now being held in solitary confinement, which I believe is a form of torture. And they have protested about it in the California prisons. And this summer they're planning a hunger strike. I think it's supposed to start in July, to protest the inhumane condition of being held for extended periods in isolation and subjected to dehumanizing treatment. And that's something the public rarely hears about also.
So touching on the number one offense that people are incarcerated for are drug charges. What's the RCP's view on either continuing to have drugs be illegal or legalizing drugs?
Do they have an official position?
I don't think people should be criminalized, but I think we're talking about in the future society, there would be room for people to relax in different ways, but our main focus is we need to get to a different kind of society that actually values people as human beings. And in this society today, on every level, this is a culture that commodifies everything, that dehumanizes people. I mean, we haven't even talked about the treatment of women in this society, in this pervasive spread of violent pornographies. So there's a whole realm of things in the culture. The whole culture would have to be transformed. And that would take a new foundation for society. I don't think there's going to be any real breakthroughs within this whole paradigm of capitalism and imperialism, which is how we see, the system today. The whole thing has to be uprooted. And then we can talk about, well, how will a revolutionary culture that allows people to really express themselves and release their creativity, how would that work in relation to things like marijuana and but the way it's being done now, it's almost like an intentional plan. And people involved in fighting mass incarceration that we work with, they've described it as a slow genocide, actually, this whole idea of criminalizing black and brown youth, a slow genocide that could escalate to a more deadly genocide on a whole other level, because for us, it's a form of counterinsurgency against a section of the population that's been identified as a potential threat to the system. So even before there's a real insurgency, like in the 60s, there was an insurgency among especially black people in America, so that the rulers are thinking, we don't want to let it get to that point again. So this whole thing of incarceration and brutality and ruling through terror, to us, it's a form of slow genocide and counterinsurgency before the actual insurgency. So people should think about that. What's going on here,
That's true.
And to get back a little bit to your question, I'd also say, the drug trade is one of the biggest industries in the world in terms of money, and so part of the idea of overthrowing capitalism is that the profit motive would no longer motivate many of the bad behaviors and bad things in the world that we see today. So if we could really implement the socialist system in this country, it would fundamentally change the drug trade throughout the world, I think, in ways that I probably can't predict. But I just think it's important to note that a large part of what is feeding any epidemic of drugs that there is profit.
That's true. So what happens to corporations in a post-revolution society? What happens to banks? How are these facets of our lives managed?
Well, we're talking about a society that's based on the needs of the people first and foremost, and there wouldn't be room for corporations and banks in that society. When you mention these names, it's like buzzwords, socialism or communism, and people think totalitarian, no individual rights. That's not how we're seeing it. And again, I really urge people to look at Bob Avakian's writings around this. And he's posed a model that really taps into people's creativity, allows space for all kinds of unleashing of artistic abilities. And it's a different mix. And I don't think there's too many people in your audience so sympathetic to the corporations and the banks. That's not a big deal. But I think people have this misconception somehow they're going to have less freedom, or somehow they're going to be stifled in their creative impulses, and that's just not how it's being posed. And Bob Avakian has studied a lot what was the best of that experience in Russia and China with their revolutions, and he's posed a different model that based on really tapping into creativity, allowing space for a whole fertile kind of a ferment of dissent and appreciating the more importance of contesting ideas. So it's very counterintuitive what he's talking about. And this is something I wish more people would debate with us about, well, why socialism, why communism? Because it's not like people like the fact that the corporations and the banks dominate, but they just think, well, there's no other model, or there's no other, there's no alternative. And that's just not true. And there's reason to be somewhat hopeful that people have the capacity to live in a different context like that. And that's really what we're trying to get people to step back and think about and take a fresh look at this whole idea of revolutionary communism.
Dave, what do you think would happen to corporations?
Well, what I want to say about corporations is, what a corporation is a form of collective, whose purpose is to generate profit, and that's organized in a way that a relatively few people get the major benefit of that profit, while a relatively many people do the work. So in a socialist society, I don't think you would do away with collectives to accomplish work, for instance, or to make things, but they would be much less hierarchical, and they would not be motivated by profit in money terms. And actually, one of the things that I think we kind of debate and think about a lot is what would be the motivations that people would pursue in that kind of society. And you know, that's a question that we're going to keep talking about while we try to move there.
So touching on that, one of the points of communism is the redistribution of wealth, the redistribution of resources. Do you think it's possible and realistic for everyone to have the same amount of income, you know, assuming that there are leaders in the post-revolution society?
I mean, no, I don't think, like, if people imagine redistribution of wealth, meaning everybody has exactly the same amount of possessions, you know, that's not what we're talking about. Because that's just, I mean, that is unrealistic, and like, it's mathematically unrealistic. You could have a society where that would maintain ongoing. And Avakian likes to say, you know, people think we're just going to make them all use the same toothbrush, and that's not true. But there would, the main thing is that, again, the way that society organizes itself to produce things and to decide what to produce would be done very differently. And one of the fundamental ideas of communism is that socialism is a transition to real communism. And the idea being that in the socialist phase, the state would help guide, you know, what do you produce, how much of it do you produce to meet the needs of the people. But the goal is that through that, the people's needs would be met to the point where everybody can participate in making those decisions and running the nation, and hopefully the world, and that therefore the state would not be important anymore in making those decisions.
I mean, that's one issue, the wealth inequality. I think the issue of how people live their lives, I think, also is being called into question. And there's something we've identified as the mental manual divide, where whole segments of society, especially around the world, they've been consigned to do the dirty work, or work with their arms, or work with their backs. And there's a whole other group, a much more of a minority, that basically does the intellectual work and deals with science and philosophy. And part of this communist revolution is breaking down that divide, giving people the opportunity to explore other realms that have been denied to them, and breaking down that divide between the mental and manual, and related to that, the idea of that some will lead and some will follow. We want to break down that divide through the process of getting to a cooperative world of communism, where everybody plays a part in terms of debating the big issues of the day, debating about things like religion, science, even issues like what's the future of the family. You know, traditionally the family has been a very patriarchal entity, you know, reinforcing the oppression of women. You know, what would the future of the family look like? Would there be families in a future society where it's more cooperatively based, and where we're trying to move beyond this patriarchal order of things?
Are there any other countries with governments that have, in your opinion, like positive aspects of communism, what actually works that you think that could be adapted in America?
Currently?
Current, yes.
I mean, you know, we don't consider Cuba, for instance, to be a real, you know, socialist country in the sense that, you know, we would advocate, but, you know, they have achieved certain things in terms of healthcare and education that, you know, benefit the vast majority of the population. There are also a lot of negatives in Cuba. But, so that's an example of, you can achieve things to benefit, you know, the vast majority of people if you make the decision that that's how you're going to, you know, direct your society's resources. Obviously, we want to do it in a different and more open way than Cuba has done it historically.
Well, I think the tough question is getting people to take a second look at what was the experience in the Soviet Union and China when they had communist governments. I don't think there is anything like that now. I mean, Mao died in 1976, so China's characterized by sweatshops and great inequality. It's not communism, but when it was, there's a lot to learn from it. It wasn't utopia, but they accomplished some things, especially issues like liberation of women, especially breaking down, making education accessible to peasants who have been treated like nothing, like less than human. There's rich lessons from that, even though we want to do better. And I think we have to break down this resistance to thinking that it's all got to be capitalism. This is the only way humans can exist, that somehow it's in our nature to be greedy and exploitative. I just don't think history explains it that way. I don't think that holds up. But you hear a lot of that these days, that this is just the natural way to live.
It's the way things are, the way they've always been.
Mm-hmm.
So we're running out of time, but I just want to ask you guys, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions of a communist in our society?
Well, we were just talking about it before we came on. The idea of that communism necessarily means that you're advocating authoritarianism or totalitarianism. We are advocating that there would be a state that makes decisions about certain aspects of society, but we have that now. We have a government, and they do make certain decisions, and apparently they make a lot of them in secret.
Apparently, yeah. we know that now.
So, for instance, we advocate decisions being made more openly and with more input. But a lot of people's impression of past communist societies is that they were entirely totalitarian, and that became true over time. I think we think the Soviet Union fell out of communism, in the 50s, if not before. And many of the countries that were referred to as communist in the Warsaw Pact weren't ever truly communist, in our opinion. They were repressive, totalitarian regimes that used communism as a justification for what they were doing. So I think the biggest misconception is that we care a lot about civil liberties and freedom, and our belief is that a socialist system can actually encourage those things to grow more.
Right. So I want to thank you guys for coming on. I hope that people watching, learn something different about the Revolution Communist Party. Rick Clipping, anything you want to plug?
Come down to Revolution Books. We're on the second floor, 1158 Mass, and certainly we want to continue this conversation. I know it's controversial. I mean, people have said another world is possible. Very few people have really explored what would that look like.